Thank you. Okay. It always feels like a seance, like I'm speaking to ghosts. Hi, can the ghosts hear me? Because I can't see anyone. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it works. Here we go. Okay, and if people want to chime in as I'm going, feel free to use the chat box. Good morning. Thank you, Professor Laksamana, for inviting me to speak to your class today. My name is Dani Magsumbol, and I am a doctoral candidate at York University in Toronto. And so I'm zooming into class today from Toronto in an area which has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. And Toronto is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And I acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So I started today with a land acknowledgement because as an immigrant to Canada, Indigenous nations and Indigenous histories weren't concepts that I was familiar with when I arrived. It wasn't something that my parents spoke to me about when we moved, when we were discussing that we were going to move to Canada. And I just didn't know anything when I arrived. It didn't even cross my mind to look deeper into what Canada was, especially as a newcomer when I was working, most of my weekdays and weekends at McDonald's trying to make ends meet while I was going to school. I just didn't have time, or, that's how I understand it now. And it wasn't until I took a year-long course in Canadian history when I was an undergrad at the University of Toronto that I sort of had more time to think about what Canada means and what it means to have a multicultural population in Canada and Canada as a settler state. So now, many years later, being a teacher or a teaching instructor at York University, which is a lot of migrant students, York University is the population tends towards immigrant students. I find that for many of my students, at least the ones that I encounter or who are in my classes, the land acknowledgement is where they first encounter indigeneity and Indigenous questions in Canada for the first time. So when I share resources about it with them, I recommend nativeland.ca, which I put on the slide here. And I also recommend to them the video that York University's Center for Aboriginal Student Services made, which is about 8 minutes long and speaks to what land acknowledgements are and should be. So I'm also going to share a little bit about myself because it informs the way that I understand the world and how I approach academia and academic analysis, as well as my own research. So I was born and raised in the Philippines, and I moved to Canada over a decade ago in 2010. So it's been a while. My mom came to Canada as a labor migrant herself through the live-in caregiver program. And that was how she got permanent residency through that program. And eventually, after many, many years of separation, that was also how she managed to get myself and my brother to join her in Canada. Because of her experiences and the things that she went through as a labor migrant, as a caregiver, and because of our experiences together as a family that was separated long term due to labor migration, when I decided that I was going to pursue graduate studies, I decided that my focus was going to be on questions of immigration within the Canadian context. And I was always interested in the ways that cities and immigrants shaped and influenced each other. So for example, how the built environment in urban settings creates spaces for folks to inhabit and to experience in very specific ways. So I decided I was going to do my master's in urban planning at the University of Toronto. And while I was doing my master's, it was there that I was introduced to this concept of how we separate public and private space. which seems intuitive, right? Nothing groundbreaking to the fact that there's a difference between public and private spaces. But there are spaces that are public, like parks and sidewalks, and there are spaces that are private, like your home, your bedroom, and there's also some spaces that are privately owned but publicly accessible, like shopping centers and malls. So in my master's, I decided to turn my attention to this idea of the home and what privacy means in the context of home and family, because I was fascinated by the ways in which different people seem to have different experiences of what privacy meant inside the domestic sphere, inside the home, or what privacy even was. So the case study that I chose for my master's was Filipino live-in caregivers in Canada and what their experiences were, very specifically as migrant workers who were required to live with their employers, to reside in the same spaces that they were working in. How did the introduction of someone who was being paid wages, who was also a foreigner, who wasn't Canadian, how did introducing that person into the private space of the home change the relationship of a family, or change the way that family members interact, both with each other and with a live-in caregiver? And I'll talk more about that a little later in the lecture when we discuss the family and the home. And so for my doctorate, which I'm working on right now, I built on the research that I did for my master's. I decided to focus more on the labor and citizenship side of migration. And my case study continues to be the Filipino labor diaspora. And as a political scientist, some of the questions that I'm asking right now is, what does it mean for countries like the Philippines to send out its citizens as workers all over the world on purpose, almost like its citizens were commodities or export goods? How does that change the relationship between the individual and the state, and how does that change our ideas of belonging when we as citizens belong to a nation? And also what happens when families have members who live abroad for work long term? How does that change? Does it change the way that families relate to each other? So these are some of the things that I ask in the work that I'm doing. In my lecture today, we're going to approach questions of race within the sphere of migrant labor, breaking it down into 3 sections. So we're going to talk about part 1, the family and the migrant worker; part 2, waged care work and the private home, which I put in air quotes there; part 3, the role of emotions in labor and migration; and then we're going to have some concluding thoughts. Oh, thank you, Kirsten. That's encouraging to hear. So part 1, the home, the family, and the migrant worker. So when society at large talks about the family, whether that's films or TV shows, or even politicians who are campaigning for election or re-election, when they talk about the family, often what is being referred to is the heteronormative patriarchal model of the nuclear family. And this is the ideal or idealized image of the family. What this means is that the most societally desirable or ideal image of what the family is the 2-parent household with a father and a mother. And of course, that desirability and that notion that it is ideal means that it comes with expectations too. Expectations that have been around for many generations, for hundreds of years. One of these expectations has to do with gender. So if you're looking at a family unit, if we imagine that we are analyzing a family unit and we use gender for our analysis, one of the factors that will come up is that the female parent or the mother is expected to be the one performing tasks of social reproduction. So social reproduction is just the work that is necessary in households for the reproduction of the family, and is a term that includes, broadly speaking, everything from child and elder care to domestic work. So the cleaning and cooking, passing on of values, of stories, all of that is under the umbrella of social reproduction. So those are expectations of the female parent, while expectations around the male parent or the father is expected to be the one working in a career and providing an income for the family. But if you've been in this society for any number of years, you will likely know that however idealized and deeply embedded in culture and politics the heteronormative patriarchal way of imagining a family is, it's just one way of being a family. On paper, for example, I come from a single parent household. And when my brother and I moved to Canada, we were raised by our mom, who is indeed a single parent. I was raised by a single mom. But while we were in the Philippines, we were raised by our aunties, our titas, and her family, and we were often with our grandparents during the summers. So what this means is that, excuse me, ostensibly my brother and I were raised by our extended family, and we were at some points members of an intergenerational household when all of us were together for months at a time. And there's also families with male single parents, families with two dads, families with two moms. And the idea of the intergenerational household, which is often defined here in Canada as parents, grandparents, and grandchildren residing in the same house. Well, intergenerational households can be found the world over. So all this to say, the idealized version of the family is just one way of being and just one way of existing together as a family. And we haven't even discussed chosen family, which is also very important. But especially in North America and in certain fields of study, sociology, for example, I think anthropology too. Kevin, you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, and in poli-sci as well. But what is considered a normative model of a family is still the patriarchal model, which is in itself very deeply embedded in gendered expectations, as we mentioned earlier. So women are expected to cook and to clean, and these have become tasks that are in addition to their own waged work or their own paid labor. In fact, the concept of the second shift, which you can see on the slide here, was coined in 1989 by Arlie Hochschild, a feminist sociologist. So the second shift refers to, oh, Jamie is saying, in my indigenous culture, it is the same. Yeah, we see reflections of this across the world. It's not just when we talk about things being North American models, that often is a reflection of the limitation of our own perspectives on things. Thank you for sharing. So the second shift refers to the phenomenon of a woman coming home from her job where she is paid a wage. Maybe she did 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, however long, where she is paid a wage, and then she finishes that job. She comes home and does a second shift at home to take care of the family, cooking, childcare, dishes, the cleaning, what have you. So that is considered a second shift. And we saw during the pandemic, especially during the earlier lockdowns, that generally speaking, again, it became women who bore the brunt of performing household chores and domestic work during this time. So the gendered expectations that surround the family unit and the work that is associated with the household continues. And even though two-income households have become far more common now, and in fact necessary in many cases to raise a family, still what is considered normative is the ideals that are associated with a single income two-parent household. So what is considered a heteronormative family unit in mainstream Western understandings of what an idealized family looks like is, a two-parent household, one mom, one dad, two kids, car in the garage, white picket fence, a house in the suburbs. So these are like idealized imaginations of what families look like. And that description alone, and the things that are embedded in that sentence, for example, contains expectations of gender. So in that idealized family, who does the laundry, who does the dishes? It has expectations embedded in it of income, who should be making money to take care of the home and pay for the mortgage. It even has expectations of societally acceptable urban planning in it, which is, why are the suburbs considered a great place to raise kids? And even transportation. Because when you start talking about the suburbs, then you ask, why is it necessary to have a vehicle to raise a family when one lives in the suburbs? So all this to say, the idealized image of the family unit, the heteronormative patriarchal nuclear family model, is one that is really embedded in what society understands to be or wants to be ideal, being in the suburbs, and supposedly having enough of an income so that only one parent can work. All of these things are contained within that model. It is societally textualized. Now, what does all of this have to do with migrant labor and care work? In Canada, care work and socially reproductive work, like housekeeping and caretaking and nannying, are fields of labor where we can see a lot of migrants fulfilling the work that the nation needs to be done. For the purposes of this class, when we will be discussing what care work is in a broad, expansive sense. So care work includes social reproduction, as mentioned earlier, which is the work that is necessary in households to reproduce individuals and families. And care work also includes skilled professional work like midwifery and nursing. And while care work is performed both in the private setting, such as the home, and public settings, such as by healthcare workers in hospitals and clinics, today we focus on care work that is provided and paid for in the privacy of the domestic sphere. So care work is often gendered, as I'm sure many of you will have noticed or felt. Care work is gendered in that it skews socially and professionally towards feminine and feminized bodies. And you can, for example, look at nursing as a field and see that it is overwhelmingly female. Same thing with teaching as a field, which is also overwhelmingly female, especially when it comes to high school and elementary school. And care work in Canada, in the way that we are discussing it today, is also often racialized in that it is performed by folks who are not white Canadians. So care and the way that it is accessed or granted or provided is deeply bound in the histories that make up our societies, including factors such as gender and race, and also citizenship status, which when you're talking about migrant labor is something that you should incorporate in your own analysis. So the heteronormative model of the family, that patriarchal nuclear family that we spoke about earlier, shapes the way that migrant work is approached when it comes to hiring migrants to provide the work of social reproduction and taking care of the family, whether that is for a child or for an elderly family member. And we can see this, for example, in the gender of the people who were hired to perform this work. So migrant workers who provided live-in care work in Canada were overwhelmingly women and majority Filipino women in the 1990s up until 2013 when the live-in caregiver program ended and was replaced. So we can trace this tendency to want to hire a woman to do what is considered women's work, caretaking, cooking, cleaning, other areas of domesticity in the home, as a reflection of these gendered roles and expectations that we can find in the family unit. In other words, it continues the gender division of labor, where women are, societally assigned and expected to fulfill the tasks of taking care of the home and the children, while men are to earn the wages that are necessary to maintain the home. And hiring migrant workers from the global south, from places like the Philippines, for example, does not disrupt gendered expectations, and in fact preserves it, allows it to continue. What it does is it puts a woman or a migrant worker in charge of domestic work in the household, while the female parent can focus on her career in addition to the male parent. And what we see here in the live-in caregiver program is an example of how gender, as in the gendered expectations of who takes care of the home, intersects with legal status, as in a woman who is not a Canadian citizen takes care of the home and the family, intersects with race, because overwhelmingly the migrant workers hired to do the work are women from the Philippines and are visibly not white. So the labor of the home is offloaded onto the shoulders of another woman, albeit someone who is in the country, at least officially on a temporary basis, who, in order to do this sort of work, have to leave their own families behind and hope that they can access permanent residency afterwards. One of the relationships then that connects Canada and the Philippines with regards to the care industry is that of labor. So the benefits that Canada receives from employing temporary migrant workers for care work are, of course, immediately apparent within the home, because hiring a migrant worker to provide the cooking and the cleaning allows them to free up more of their own time. But it also extends beyond the provision of basic domestic labor. And among other things, parents that employ a live-in caregiver are able to pursue their own careers with less pressure to maintain a home, and they're able to work longer hours if need be, without the worry of laundry piling up or having to find childcare or cooking for sustenance. So the work of social reproduction is still taken on by women within the spaces of the home, of the household. And the gendered expectations of domestic work continues undisturbed. But this time, instead of, in these particular case studies, it's instead of the Canadian-born female parent performing social reproduction, it's performed by migrant women who live in the homes of their families of employment on the basis of a work visa. So when families access the global labor market to hire Filipino women as live-in care workers, the female parent is then able to maintain these heteronormative social societal expectations of families and households by sharing some of the responsibilities of motherhood with a female domestic worker. And that brings us to part 2, waged care work and the private home. For this part of the lecture, as we have for most of this, again, we focus on the live-in caregiver program, or the LCP. And within that example, we will look at the relationships between employers and employees, how that changes when the worker lives with their boss, and how that is impacted by the worker not having permanent legal status in their country of employment while their employer does. Now, if we approach the live-in caregiver program from the mainstream perspective of policymakers and economic analysts, it seems to be a mutually beneficial labor migration program, one that fills a gap and serves a purpose both for the sending country, or the Philippines, and the receiving country, or Canada. So for the country that is sending labor migrants to Canada, mainly Filipino women that provide care and domestic labor to Canadian families, what they get in return is a steady flow of remittances that are a vital component of the Philippine GDP. And for the country that is receiving migrant women as live-in care workers, they get care for the very young or the very elderly, and oftentimes for the rest of the family too, in exchange for room and board and their wages. So receiving countries get, quote, low-skilled jobs fulfilled by women who are in many cases highly educated, while the migrant workers in turn are provided with employment and a possible pathway to permanent residence, perhaps even citizenship one day, and reunification with their families in Canada. So migrant domestic work, as it's understood in Canada, often involves having a migrant worker live with a family that employs them, again, in large part because the LCP ran from 1992 to 2013, which is about over a decade long, and it's quite a long time. In these live-in arrangements, there is always a blurred line between how employers and employees think about what has been paid for. So in other words, what is the work that a migrant worker has been hired to do and is paid to be performed for their employers, and the work that is not paid for but is informally expected that they will do anyway. So legally, live-in caregivers were only supposed to care for one individual and their associated needs, whether that was an infant or an elderly person. However, what often happened, and this happened to every person I interviewed during my master's, and is also quite well discussed in the academic literature surrounding live-in care work, what often happens in households that employ live-in care workers is that the migrant worker ends up taking care of the entire household, from cooking meals for the entire family, to doing everyone's laundry, to cleaning up and tidying up the whole house. And that is exponentially more work than having to take care of one person. One of my interviewees, in fact, told me that when she was doing laundry for the 5-person household that she was taking care of, it became a 3-day long affair for her, from the first load to folding up the last bit of laundry. And this was every week. So when a worker lives with their employer, there is also a high chance that they will be called on even after their official work hours to do more work. And this was a fairly common event, according to the women I spoke to. Things which range from their employers asking them to babysit after their work hours were over because they wanted to go out. Like they would knock on their doors at like 8 p.m. and ask, "We couldn't find a babysitter. Could you just take care of our child, even though you're off the clock?" So things like that. And many times, this is unpaid work, and it's reflective of the blurriness because the employing family might start saying that the migrant worker is part of the family. Like there becomes a process of incorporation of the family of employment starting to say that the migrant worker they have hired to perform labor for them, who they pay a wage for, they start thinking of this person as part of their family. And wouldn't you do unpaid favors for your family too? So in other words, there is a sense that when a worker lives with their employer, they're constantly on call with little space to truly disconnect from their work. And this is something I think that most folks now have more of an understanding of, especially after the pandemic took many of us to a work from home setting, and realized that not having a solid boundary between work and home is quite detrimental to one's mental health. And now I want us to turn our attention at this point to infrastructure. When I use the word infrastructure, I'm not just referring to urban architecture or the built environment, although those are part of that as well. Here we're going to discuss two categories of infrastructure that affect the everyday life of a family. Material infrastructure, which is the place of residence, or the house itself as a shared space between the family and the live-in care and domestic worker, and social infrastructure, or the structures of the family itself, which is the relationships that make it a family. So the house as a material infrastructure creates spaces of intimacies through daily close interactions between the family of employment and the migrant worker. You can't help but maybe become close because you are occupying the same space together consistently every day. And because they reside together, again, because the migrant worker is obliged to live with them, familial relationships are often established, not all the time, but often established between the parties that are involved. So this additionally blurs the line between the wage relationship, or what labor is paid for by a wage, and the familial relationship, where we don't expect payment when our siblings come to us for emotional support, for example. So this leads to the care worker providing more work to the family of employment, whether that's measured in hours or extended labor, than was previously agreed upon. And while the living in condition can, of course, lead to mental exhaustion, this also leads to a situation of labor exploitation, wage theft, and surveillance, up to and including what the employee is doing in their spare time. So the imbalance of the power dynamics between the employee and the employer are exacerbated when they live in the same residence, one that is owned by the employer, especially when the employer has power over the employee's migrant status because of their work visa being temporary and being tied to the person that they work for. And two of the biggest reasons for the labor exploitation that happens to migrant workers are the live-in requirement and the fact that the women do not have citizenship status on arrival. Again, the live-in requirement creates this spatial or proximity and emotional proximity to the family of employment, as we mentioned earlier, being on call constantly, mixing responsibilities of what is considered being part of the family versus being an employed or waged member of the household, and also includes privacy problems. So the legal obligation of living with one's employees can have a spectrum of negative effects on the migrant worker. And these experiences are well documented across both academic and activist circles. and they run the spectrum from not having a clear boundary between being on duty and off duty, to experiences of food deprivation and hunger, to some care workers not having their own private rooms, to threats of deportation being made by the employers against the migrant worker when they exhibit behavior that they personally consider to be unacceptable. So characteristics that broadly define a private home, such as personal safety and privacy, are experienced very differently by the employer and the employee. And I will share two specific incidents among the many shared with me by my interviewees. Keep in mind that a person who has hired a live-in care worker legally has to or is supposed to provide them with a room that they can lock. But the first is a story from Nelda. So Nelda was given her own bedroom, but she had to share a bathroom with an adult male family member who she was very uncomfortable with. And she explained her discomfort with this arrangement at having to share such an intimate space with essentially a stranger. But her employer informed her that they would be unable to do anything about the situation. And while she did have her own bedroom, it did not come with a lock, so she couldn't lock the door after herself in the evening. So a safety measure that she used during this time was record her room at night using her phone to make sure that nobody was coming into her room when she was asleep and unable to defend herself. And the second is a story from JT. So although JT was hired as a live-in caregiver, she was actually working 2 shifts every day, and not in the way that the second shift was that we were discussing earlier. From 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., she was working at her employer's daycare center, immediately followed by working at her employer's home as a live-in caregiver from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., with no breaks in between, and in clear violation of her work contract as a live-in caregiver for the family of employment, not for a daycare center. So while Nelda's story was about her physical and bodily safety, JT's story is about labor exploitation. And what these two stories have in common is that the privacy that we as a society associate with the home serves to conceal these incidences, because the home is a private space and we understand it as such, and it is regulated as such. There are few recourses for folks to report that their employers are not following what was laid out in their contract. And migrant workers also worry about being deported because their work status is so precarious. So the privacy of a home means something very different to an employer and to an employee. Nelda's and JT's stories, while being very different, are reflective of the power asymmetry that a live-in caregiver experiences when they live in their employer's home. And it also reflects the effects of gender and race and citizenship status that they experience as migrant workers in Canada. So their experiences of labor exploitation and of feeling unsafe are directly tied to their working conditions and their living conditions. Another way to understand or approach the complications that emerge in live-in care situations is through social infrastructure, as we mentioned earlier. So oftentimes, families of employment begin to say that the live-in migrant worker who they employ and who lives with them is, quote, part of the family. And this is a relationship that I call the migrant as part of the family model of care. So this expands on Bettio et al.'s analysis of elderly care in Italy, where they actually traced what they observed to be a transition from a family model of care, where it's your family that takes care of elderly members of the family, like you keep it in the family unit, as it were, to a migrant in the family model of care, where Italy hires a lot of migrant care workers also to take care of their elderly. And so I trace this to what is happening in Canada, which is the migrant as part of the family model of care, where many, not all, but many employers will start to think of their employees as part of the family. And I broadly define the migrant as part of the family model as a consolidation of the wage relationship and the familial expectations that characterize the relationship between an employer and an employee. And this process of integrating the migrant worker into the family is often understood as inclusive. And in fact, some of the women that I spoke to during fieldwork indicated that they preferred to be treated like members of the family. And so I'm not here to discount the fact that in some cases, the affection between a family and a migrant worker is very real and can continue often until after the terms of employment. I've seen it happen where a former live-in caregiver goes to visit the family that they used to work for because they really did form strong bonds of affection, or they keep in touch through emails and through texts. What I'm trying to trace here is that what is being expressed in this very inclusive term is not so much membership in the family as much as it is membership in the household. In the migrant as part of the family model, the fusion of familial membership, or a membership that is rooted in love and affection, and the wage relationship, wherein it's a membership that is, paid for with a wage, creates an imbalance or a further asymmetrical membership in the family unit that is conditional and subject to change. So the employer has the power to claim the migrant worker into the family and also has the power to expel them from the family unit should they so desire as punishment. And that too is something that happens. The employer has the power to withdraw membership and affection if the migrant worker starts displaying behavior that the employer does not agree with or considers undesirable. And this conditionality is at odds with expectations around a wage relationship, where if you are, being paid a wage, you should still keep getting paid regardless of whether or not you are on good terms with your boss. Like, that's not an affective relationship, that is a wage relationship. So one example of this that arose in the interviews was a care worker's employer who asked her, "I thought we were a family, why are you refusing?" when she refused to clean her employer's very large chandeliers. And consequently, they did not speak to her for like a month after that incident. Again, despite this, some of my interviewees still prefer to be treated like family members. And so I asked them, for you, what does it mean to be treated like a member of the family? And many of the answers that they gave were very emotionally complicated, and I'm going to give a few examples. But most of it had to do with being treated as persons, not just as workers. So several people said that being treated like a family member meant they were allowed to eat at the same time and at the same table with the family, or they were allowed to take holidays and were shown verbal expressions of concern and appreciation. And some of them mentioned being shown fondness in daily interactions. And one of them, Lisa, expressed, I think, the consequences of family treatment in the simplest manner. And one that really illustrates what happens when you merge the wage relationship and the family relationship. So Lisa said, being treated like family meant that she was happy with them, and so she did not mind her hours being extended, even without pay. And that's where the blurriness that I was speaking about happens, when those two relationships are merged together. So the migrant as part of the family model of care is itself, it almost seems like a promise that the differences between a migrant worker and her employer does not matter. So differences that can include citizenship status, ethnicity, gender, or even class. And the care workers assumed membership in the family unit is a reassurance that she will be treated like she belongs, like she is one of them. However, this model also superficially presents both parties as equal in their social interactions, and it sort of hides the fact that the employer has considerable control over the migrant worker's mobility, time, employment, and to a certain extent, her possible future as a Canadian citizen. Her inclusion into the family also doesn't really expand on what her expected role actually is, which is that of the female parent or the mother who supplies labor for the tasks that we need to do to keep the household going, like laundry and cooking and cleaning. And there's no set expectation that the family takes care of her too, the way that she's taking care of them. So from these, we can see how the material infrastructure of the house of residence, along with the social infrastructure of the family, can serve as tools of discipline. So from a material infrastructure perspective, the residence, the home, the house, creates intimacy through daily close interactions between the migrant worker and her family of employment, blurring the line between waged work and unpaid for labor that family members tend to perform for each other. From a social perspective, prioritizing the workers' responsibilities to the family of employment has been used to draw boundaries between what is considered to be acceptable and unacceptable behavior from the care workers. One of my interviewees, for example, was explicitly not allowed to leave the house even on weekends because her employer was afraid that she would bring back germs, a sentiment that is so full of problematic themes that we do not have time to unpack today. So those are the social infrastructure and material infrastructure. And that brings us to part 3, or the political economy of emotions, or what is the role of emotions in labor and migration? So how does emotion enter into the conversation of labor migration, particularly or specifically the labor migration of Filipino care workers in Canada? In my research, this is a framework that I am developing. When I say framework, I really just mean a way to understand or approach a given case study or a given situation that I'm calling the political economy of emotions. So I broadly define it as powerful emotions such as love, guilt, even anger or resentment that runs through labor export in the Philippines and moves its citizens abroad as labor migrants. So the concept of the political economy of emotions, or this focus on emotions in labor and migration, began for me when I was doing fieldwork for my master's, and I was asking questions about safety and labor experiences and citizenship status. And the women I was interviewing would bring up their emotions, and they would answer my questions, discussing how they felt about the situations. But emotions, though, were not something that I encountered a lot in my own training as an urban planner, particularly because urban planning is a very technically oriented, policy-focused field. And I knew that for many Filipino labor migrants, and this is not limited to Filipinos at all, love and labor are very deeply intertwined. And I realized that it was important to incorporate these emotions into research work. So take, for example, this situation. A Filipino citizen in the Philippines decides that they would like to work abroad and that they would like to work as a live-in care worker in Canada because that would pay them more money than they're perhaps currently making in their job. And it would also maybe give them the opportunity to pursue Canadian citizenship. But it's never as neat as that. The choices to migrate when they are made are not just economic choices, they're also relational choices. And what this means is the person is making the choice or decision to migrate in relation to their family. Maybe they think that a future in Canada is what they want or what would be better for their kids or their spouse, or maybe they were the best choice in the family unit to leave for work abroad rather than their sister or their brother or their cousin or their partner. And these decisions are made knowing that for them, leaving their children at home while they work abroad is not something that they necessarily want to do, or being away from their spouse for years on end. It's not something that they had planned on originally. And they might feel a lot of guilt and a lot of resentment about that. They might also feel that they are making the choice to leave because of the love that they have for their families. And this is what I mean by the political economy of emotions, that when we think about and analyze migration and labor and gender and citizenship status and race, we make sure that we include the totality of the decision-making process, from the economic to the emotional, because that is the experience of being human. You can't really excise emotions from how we go through life. And we can also track emotions, for example, in the experiences of Filipino families who are waiting to be reunited with a family member abroad. While the trauma of separation is often experienced in the present time, in the now, many transnational families live in a way that is future oriented. For example, while a family member is away in the country of employment and the rest of the family in the Philippines, you will often hear phrases like, when mom comes home, or when we finally see each other again, or when we are finally together again. And this orientation towards the future carries with it feelings of love and hope, sometimes desperation and anger or resentment. And there's a lot of waiting for a future that is coming, and the collective habitation of a future where the family unit will finally transition from being together through virtual spaces that is mediated through screens and FaceTime and Skype and all of that into being physically reunited, whether that reunification is in the homeland or in the new host country. And Bobby is saying, I always wonder how they're able to do that. I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. I'm just saying how unbearable that must be. Yeah, correct. And this is why I think including emotional analysis is important, because it allows us to understand the hows and the whys of doing something that we can't imagine. Like, I was away from my mom for a long time. She left when I was 7. I was 19 when we were reunited. And so, there was a lot of time in there, and it was a lot of things to happen, but also a lot of processing things together as a family, because it wasn't something that was done just for economic reasons. It was also done for relational reasons, as I was saying earlier. And so Filipino labor migrants and their families, and it's not just Filipino labor migrants, it's labor migrants in general and their families, they experience what it means like to be a family across geographic distance in different time zones, but also they inhabit a present together in a way that is visionary. And so they are waiting and working toward a future where they finally will be together. And the Philippine state compels a lot of its own citizens to participate in the global labor market. And this is couched in terms of like familial responsibility. Like, if you can't find a job where you are, if you're at home, then an option is to leave. And so often this is framed in terms of personal responsibility. Well, it's your responsibility to take care of your family, whether that's as a good parent or as a good child, a good aunt, what have you. And so there are emotions that are deeply embedded in the decision to leave. And for many Filipino labor migrants, the right to work, the right to pursue employment seems to be at odds with the right to stay. Because to work, you have to leave. And so the intimacies that characterize a family are expected to stretch across national borders and time zones and hold fast and hold people together, and they do. Not neatly, but they do. And as the Filipino labor diaspora experiences, love is not something that is confined inside borders. Of necessity, love and familial love has been performed in both tangible and intangible ways, long distance. And during the pandemic, I think the world got a little glimpse of what it means for labor migrants and their families to love, and to love hard through distance and isolation. And that brings us to the concluding points of today's lecture, which is that we spoke about the entanglements between ideas of domestic privacy, differences between experiences of what a private is, even within the same household. And we spoke about social reproduction and labor migration and the complexities of tier and social infrastructure that sort of creates the environment within which a family experiences each other. And as we can see here on the slides, when discussing migration and migrants, it's important to consider gender and citizenship status in one's analysis as well, because those things change the way that people interact and move with each other. And there are different ways to imagine differences between what is private and what is public with regards to inhabited space. And finally, emotions aren't necessarily something to avoid when it comes to analysis. And that's everything from me today. If you have any questions, you can reach me by email. My email address is on this slide. Yeah,